I never believed the old stories about the snow in our town until it was too late. But that's exactly what happened. My name is Sarah, and I moved to this small mountain town in Vermont last winter to get away from the stress of city life. The locals were friendly enough, but they all said the same weird thing when they found out I was living alone in that cabin at the edge of the forest. They told me the snow here was different, that it felt alive, especially during the coldest nights. I just laughed it off and thought they were trying to scare the new city girl. My cabin was small but cozy, surrounded by tall pine trees and about a mile from the nearest neighbor. I loved the peace and quiet. The first few weeks were perfect. I'd spend my days reading by the fireplace and my nights watching the snow fall outside my window. Everything felt calm and safe. Then one night in late January, everything changed. I woke up around 2 a.m. to complete silence. The kind of silence that feels too quiet, like the whole world is holding its breath. I got out of bed to get some water and happened to look out my bedroom window. That's when I saw them. Footprints in the fresh snow, leading from the forest straight to my window. But these weren't normal footprints. They were the exact same size and shape as mine, like someone had traced them perfectly. I pressed my face against the cold glass to get a better look, my breath fogging up the window. I wiped the condensation away with my hand, and that's when I saw her. Standing about 20 feet from my window in the falling snow was a figure, a woman. She looked exactly like me. Same height, same hair, same pajamas I was wearing right now. She just stood there, completely still, staring at my window, staring at me. I stumbled backward and fell onto my bed, my heart pounding so hard I thought it would burst out of my chest. I couldn't move. I couldn't scream. I just sat there, frozen in fear for what felt like hours. When I finally got the courage to look out the window again, she was gone. Just empty snow and those footprints leading back into the forest. I didn't sleep at all that night. I sat in my living room with all the lights on until sunrise. The next morning I tried to convince myself it was just a nightmare, or maybe I had been sleepwalking and seeing things. I made coffee and tried to calm down. But then I noticed something that made my blood run cold. There was a new set of footprints in the snow. These ones started at my front door and led into the forest. My footprints. But I hadn't gone outside. I grabbed my coat and boots and followed the trail. The footprints led deep into the woods, weaving between trees for what felt like miles. Then they just stopped at a small clearing, and that's where I found myself. I was lying in the snow, curled up and freezing, wearing the same pajamas from last night. I had no memory of leaving my cabin, no memory of walking through the forest. Nothing. I managed to stumble back home, my whole body shaking from cold and fear. When I got inside, I immediately started packing. I didn't care about the lease or losing my deposit. I needed to leave right away. As I was throwing clothes into my suitcase, I glanced out my bedroom window one more time. There in the snow stood the figure again, that perfect copy of me, watching the cabin. But this time, she was smiling. I left that day and never went back. I moved to Arizona, where it never snows. The locals in that Vermont town tried to warn me. They said the snow was alive, that it watched you and learned from you. I should have listened. Sometimes on cold nights, even here in the desert, I wake up and feel like something is watching me through my window. And I wonder if she followed me somehow. If that thing in the snow is still out there, still wearing my face, still waiting. I never thought a winter storm would be the last thing my brother would ever see. But that's exactly what happened. My name is Daniel, and this story is about my older brother, Michael. We grew up in a small town in northern Michigan, right next to Lake Superior. Every winter, the lake would freeze over completely, turning into this massive sheet of ice that stretched as far as you could see. But the winter of 2023 was different. It started in early February when the worst ice storm in decades hit our town. The power went out and the temperature dropped to -20 degrees. On the third night of the storm, something strange started happening on the lake. My neighbor, Mrs. Chen, called me around 9 p.m. and told me to look out my window toward the lake. I could barely see anything through the blowing snow. But then I spotted them, lights moving across the frozen surface. Not regular lights like flashlights. These were cold blue lights that seemed to glow from within, drifting slowly just above the ice. There were at least a dozen of them, moving in strange patterns like they were searching for something. I called Michael right away and told him what I was seeing. He said he'd been watching the lights for about an hour and couldn't figure out what they were. We both agreed it was probably just some weird reflection from the storm. But then the next day, some of the neighborhood kids came to my door looking terrified. They told me they'd been playing near the frozen lake and saw something under the ice. People. They said they saw people trapped under the frozen surface, their faces pressed up against the ice from below, trying to get out. I told them they were just seeing shadows, but they insisted they knew what they saw. Michael didn't believe the kids. That night, the blue lights appeared again, brighter and more active than before. Michael called me and said he was going to walk out onto the lake to see what was causing them. I told him that was a terrible idea, that the ice might not be stable, but he wouldn't listen. I watched from my window as Michael walked onto the frozen lake with his flashlight. The blue lights seemed to notice him immediately. They started drifting toward him, surrounding him in a wide circle. Then he knelt down on the ice, pulled off his glove, and started wiping away the frost on the surface. Even from my window, I could see him jump backward suddenly. He scrambled to his feet and started running back toward shore. But he only made it a few steps before he stopped completely, standing frozen in place. The blue lights moved closer, forming a tight ring around him. Then I heard it, a sound like thunder. The ice was cracking. I ran outside without even grabbing my coat, screaming Michael's name. But I was too late. The ice beneath him shattered, and he fell through into the black water below. The blue lights descended down into the hole after him, disappearing beneath the surface. I ran toward the lake, but stopped at the edge, too afraid to go onto the ice. I called 911 immediately. They found Michael the next morning about 50 yards from where he fell through. He was frozen solid. But what made everyone feel sick was his face. His eyes were wide open, staring up at nothing, and his mouth was frozen in a silent scream. Before the police arrived, I went to the spot where Michael had knelt down and looked through the cleared frost. I saw them. Dozens of pale hands pressed up against the underside of the ice, reaching upward, and faces. So many faces looking up at me with their mouths open, screaming without sound. I stumbled backward and ran home. The blue lights haven't appeared since that night. I moved away as soon as I could. Sometimes late at night, I still see those blue lights when I close my eyes, and I wonder how many people are down there under the ice, trapped and reaching upward, waiting for someone else to look down and see them. never thought a power outage would turn into the most terrifying night of my life, but that's exactly what happened. My name is David, and I live alone in a small house on the outskirts of Burlington, Vermont. December 2024 brought one of the worst winter storms the state had seen in years. The snow started falling on a Friday afternoon and didn't stop for 3 days straight. On the second night of the storm, around 8 p.m., the power went out across the entire county. I wasn't too worried at first. I had candles, a fireplace, and enough food to last me a week. I lit some candles around the house and got a fire going in the living room. Everything seemed fine. Then, around 10 p.m., my landline phone rang. I still had an old landline because cell service was terrible out here, and it was more reliable during emergencies. I picked up the phone and said hello. There was silence for a few seconds. Then I heard a voice. It was barely a whisper, so quiet I had to press the phone hard against my ear to hear it. The voice said, "Don't let the cold in," and then the line went dead. I stood there confused, thinking it was probably just a prank call, or maybe a bad connection from the storm. I hung up and went back to sitting by the fire. About 20 minutes later, the phone rang again. I picked it up and heard the same whispered voice, clearer this time. "Don't let the cold in." I asked who this was and what they wanted, but the line went dead again. The phone kept ringing every 20 minutes for the next 2 hours. Same whispered message every single time. "Don't let the cold in." I stopped answering after the 5th call, but the ringing continued. I unplugged the phone from the wall, but somehow it kept ringing anyway. That's when I started to get really scared. Around midnight, I noticed something strange. Even though I had a good fire going in the fireplace, the temperature inside my house was dropping. I could see my breath forming white clouds in front of my face. I put on a heavy jacket and added more wood to the fire, but it didn't help. The cold was spreading through the house like it was alive, creeping along the walls and floor. I decided to check the windows to make sure they were all closed and locked. When I looked out the front window, my heart nearly stopped. There were people standing in my yard, dozens of them, maybe 30 or 40, all standing perfectly still in the falling snow. They were spread out across my lawn, all facing my house, all staring directly at me. But their faces weren't normal. Even in the darkness, I could see that their skin was pale blue, the color of frozen flesh. Their eyes were wide open, and their mouths hung slightly open like they were trying to speak, but couldn't. They didn't move. They didn't blink. They just stood there in the snow, staring. I backed away from the window and ran to check the other windows in the house. They were at every window, surrounding my entire house. All of them, with those horrible frozen blue faces, all of them staring at me. The phone rang again. My hands were shaking as I picked it up. The whispered voice came through, but this time it sounded different, colder, more final. "It's already inside." Dropped the phone, and that's when I felt it. A hand on my shoulder, ice cold, gripping tight. I spun around and saw one of them standing right behind me in my living room. A woman with frozen blue skin and white eyes. Her mouth opened slowly, and frost came out instead of breath. More of them were coming through the walls, passing through like the walls weren't even there. The cold was them. They were the cold. I don't remember much after that. I woke up 3 days later in the hospital. They found me unconscious in my yard, half buried in snow, suffering from severe hypothermia. The doctors said I was lucky to be alive. When I tried to tell them what happened, they said I was hallucinating from the cold. But I know what I saw. I sold that house and moved to Florida. I'll never spend another winter in the cold, and I'll never answer a ringing phone again.